Good to go. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I know you're still eating, but we've got a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to get started. So, my name's Eric Wishart. I'm a former president of the FCC and a member of the news management of AFP News Agency. My great pleasure today to introduce a very special guest, Mr. A.J. Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times. He took over the reins of the paper in January and had a very great start to his journalism career, because you were in local papers, so you've seen it from the local town council and local school boards up. And now you're heading this great news organisation, which the president does occasionally refer to as the failing New York Times. So, so we've got a lot to talk about today. So I'd just like to get going by asking you, what does the publisher actually do? What's your daily routine as the publisher of the New York Times?
Everyone hear me? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all for hosting me here today. It's a privilege to talk to you all. I'm hoping not to create an international incident or get my interviewer booted out of the country. So what's the job of the publisher? At sort of a very straightforward level, the publisher oversees both the news and business sides of the New York Times and sort of make sure that everything is pointed in the same direction. But I think spiritually, the publisher really exists to protect the editorial independence and integrity of the New York Times, to make sure that we are at no point, even in this period of pretty profound transition in our industry, straying from our journalistic mission. It's a unique role. Some of you may have them at publications you work at. Some of you may not. At the New York Times, we've got an extremely accomplished CEO. We've got an executive editor who I think is the best in the business. So my job is, as part of that team, is to spend less time thinking sort of about the next day's paper or next quarter's earnings, and really to keep my eye on the long-term horizon. How are we going to ensure that the New York Times is able to continue to produce the best journalism, for years and decades ahead?
I mean, what's your relationship with the editor, the editorial team?
I mean, it's great. It's a great team. Dean Baquet runs the newsroom, incredibly accomplished editor, former national editor, Washington bureau chief at the Times, ran the LA Times, and a great investigative reporter on his own, won a Pulitzer Prize with the Chicago Tribune many years ago. And I actually think you see that stamp, that investigative instinct of his on the report. And James Bennett runs the opinion desk. Both of them operate with broad autonomy. I'm consulted on, major decisions, moments when we're considering, breaking from tradition, using the word lie in the headline on the front page. I'm given a heads up when our 18-month investigation of the president's finances end up concluding that we can use the word fraud, but a big part of my role with them is less on the journalistic questions and more on how the place evolves.
You were involved. Were you consulted on the op-ed in September? That was written by the anonymous administration official who said he was part of the resistance. You were consulted on that?
I was.
And what do you think of the decision to publish? Because it was quite controversial at the time.
I've firmly supported the decision, I understand why it raised questions. I think there was, a pretty interesting and robust conversation about the sort of the journalistic ethics of publishing an anonymous op-ed. I mean, to me, the questions that I considered are, is this fundamentally newsworthy? Does this contribute to the public understanding of events that are unfolding? And I think the answer is, and you can just see from the reaction to it, is unequivocally yes. And the second was can you get the essence of this piece into the paper without anonymity? And I think the answer, because of the peculiarity of his argument, was clearly no. His argument was that a government official should not resign in protest, but should stay and resist within the administration. And given the threats and to use the Justice Department to ferret out the identity of this person, it was pretty clear that we could not have published with a byline attached.
So you know who it is?
Yes.
Will you tell us?
I will not. A good try. No hints. No hints.
Okay. So, I mean, looking at the Times business model, you headed up the innovation report in 2014, which I think was a major factor in you becoming a publisher 4 years later. Can you talk us through that a bit, what the recommendations were and what you've put into effect since?
Yeah. How familiar are people here aware of what the innovation report is generally? I'm seeing mostly confusion. Essentially, I produced maybe the longest corporate memo of all time. It was 100 pages. It was produced by a group of journalists, so the words were very carefully chosen. It was very carefully edited. And the thrust of it was to say that the New York Times was at risk of falling behind in a period of rapid transformation in our industry. And we had interviewed hundreds of people inside and outside the building in a variety of roles, and it ended up being sort of an urgent cry to the newsroom leadership that we could no longer hold the future at arm's length, because it was no longer the future. Digital wasn't our future; it was our present, and we had to embrace that. As far as the specific recommendations, I was never wedded to any one idea in that report. It was the essence of the report that I was really trying to get across, and I feel like it really landed. I mean, it landed in part because of what I thought was bad luck, but ended up being really good luck, which is someone leaked one of the 8 printed copies of this report to BuzzFeed, which then proceeded to publish a report in full. And the report was downloaded millions of times, spawned 1,000 think pieces, but provoked a robust and overdue conversation inside the company. And it was actually this fascinating lesson that I think that journalists, we should know intuitively, but sometimes we forget in our own shops, which is show, don't tell. And, for a generation, I think we had been telling journalists, to do things related to digital. We had been saying, write faster, write differently, get on social media, take video. But we had never been showing the reasons, how this how the news environment was changing. And we had some pretty frank, even embarrassing statistics in there and analysis in there. And I think the fact that everyone in the newsroom started this conversation with the same base of knowledge was essential for us moving forward.
And can you give us some numbers now on how you're doing digital, print? How's it holding up?
Yeah. I mean, print has been pretty stable. We're obviously feeling the same pressure on print advertising that every publication in the world is feeling, but print circulation has held quite stable. We have about 1 million print subscribers. I think the paper looks as good as it ever did, but where the real change happened was on the digital side. Our audience has grown from about 30, and this is according to ComScore, 30 to 150 million. We're now, even though we have a paywall in place, we're now, more of our articles are more read than any other publication in the country, and our subscriber base has quadrupled. So, and to me, some folks, have, pointed largely at the so-called Trump bump.
The Trump bump.
But I actually think it's a confluence of things. I think that Netflix and Spotify trained a generation to reach into their wallet to pay for internet services. I think that this election cycle, and quite frankly, this like extended news cycle, between technology and climate change and Brexit and the rise of populism all over the world, has allowed a new generation to lean in and ask themselves the question, what's the role journalism can play in my life? And then I think the digital transition really mattered for us. I think we had done a lot of the hard blocking and tackling of becoming a digital first news organization by the time those two other things happened. So I actually think there's a lot of reasons for the growth of the paper.
You started your career in local papers. You worked in the Providence Journal and the Oregonian, and the local press is really suffering. And I mean, I started in the local press, and we were talking before lunch, you covered school boards, and I think we both know how important it is to democracy that these things are covered. So how concerned, it's one thing for the New York Times, it's another thing for the Washington Post. How concerned about you are you about the future of local newspapers, and also, is there a business model for them?
I'm profoundly concerned. I think this is a crisis, and I think it's a crisis not just for journalists. I think it's a crisis for democracy. I think it's a crisis for free, fair, and informed societies. The role of local journalism is absolutely essential and cannot be replicated. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, your institution, and many others will never be big enough to fill the void that's being left by the decline of journalism. And that decline, the statistic that's been most repeated, the 50% decline in working journalists in the United States since the year 2000, which is a greater loss than the number of coal miners in that period. That should be incredibly sobering. But I actually think that there's a more insidious trend just underneath the surface that we don't talk about enough as journalists. And that trend is it's not enough to have good journalists. You have to give them the time and resources to do good work. And I think the remaining journalists, far too many, are tethered to their desks, and they're being asked to churn out 3 to 5 pieces a day. And it's largely because the historic business model, advertising, just cannot support resource-intensive journalism, which honestly, resource-intensive journalism to me translates to original journalism. It translates to journalism that impactful journalism that makes a difference, that adds to the public understanding. So, I think we're watching this slow motion crisis. You mentioned I started the Providence Journal. When I started, which is in a tiny little state called Rhode Island, we had a different reporter in every little community. I covered a community of about 10,000 people. And today I suspect that they have a couple of people covering the entire state, all from a remote office. And, so what's the business model? What's the clear path forward? I don't have an easy answer to that. I desperately wish I did. At the Times, my biggest responsibility is to figure out what the path forward is for us. And the innovation report taught me a really important lesson, which is that the Times can play a huge role in supporting the industry by sharing our lessons along the way publicly. I think the innovation report became a really useful document to a lot of other news organizations wrestling with the same challenge as we were. And subsequently, we've started publishing all of our strategy work out to the public.
So let's move on to the title of this lunch talk, How Technology Disrupted the Truth. We talk a lot about truth these days. How do you define the truth?
Well,
what is it to you?
Yeah, so I think it was Rudy Giuliani who recently on television said truth isn't truth. So I would define it the exact opposite way. I mean, truth is truth. Truth is, the pursuit of facts and an accurate understanding of what's happening in the world.
Do you think technology has disrupted the truth, or has it subverted it? I mean, what's going on? I mean, we're talking about post-truth. What do you see as the technological role in this?
Look, I don't know if it's subverted or disrupted. I'm not sure about the exact word choice. I think a confluence of trends are badly undermining society's shared ability, collective ability to get to a common truth. And that's not because of the work being done, by folks in this room. I think, I would point in many directions. I think that technology has obviously made it far easier to create and disseminate misinformation and disinformation. I think, even the ability to edit, so-called deep fake videos, is something that is, it's really troubling. And perhaps even more troubling is how much currency these are gained. I mean, famously, at the end of the election cycle, the presidential election cycle, the most shared fake news stories were shared more than the most shared real news stories. So I also think simultaneously there is a cynical and dangerous attempt by political forces all over the world to systematically try to discredit journalism and journalists for a simple reason, which is journalism and journalists are one of the few institutions poised to ask tough questions, ask impertinent questions, and hold power to account. And this is an incredibly short-sighted game that others are playing. And then I do think that there's stuff we can do as journalists to do a better job of. I think for too long we've sort of watched trust in institutions and trust in media specifically decline without really engaging in those. We watched nervously without trying to address those trends or stymie them in any way.
Move your mic close.
Oh, is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Boy, this is loud. So we watch these trends without trying to stymie them in any way. And I think what we need to do is explain the role that journalism can play in people's lives and all the work that goes into it. Because I think fundamentally we're all in the trust business in different ways.
Do you think that people living in this parallel universe of fake news and disinformation, are they going to come back to the New York Times, or do you think they're lost forever?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, is your sort of your institution's idealistic pursuit of truth and common understanding, and a belief that you can be an institution that follows the truth wherever it leads without without allegiance to a political party or any ideological movement. A lot of folks think that's naive and out of step with the moment, right? At a moment when the public is increasingly being trapped in, ideological filter bubbles. My response to that is, throughout this entire this entire period, our audience has grown more than it has in the history of the New York Times. Our subscriber base is now bigger than any American newspaper at the peak of print. So I actually think that folks are voting not just with their eyes, but with their dollars to say that supporting independent journalism matters.
Now, in July, you sat down face to face with the president. What was that like? I mean, before we get into what was said or tweeted about it,
Yeah.
what's it actually like sitting face to face with Donald Trump?
I'll tell you what I told one of my colleagues. I can't remember who it was. It may have been Dean after the meeting, which was that I felt. So you've interviewed a lot of newsmakers over the years, and you've sat across from people who, you've come to know by reputation. You've read about, you've watched on TV, and my guess is every single time you've done that, you've discovered some extra side of them that you didn't see in the coverage, right? Some dynamic, some facets of their personality that made you feel like you got one level deeper. I actually had a slightly different reaction. I left feeling, I went into the meeting, I did not know him, I had not, except in passing, shaking his hand when he came into the building for an interview once. I had never had the opportunity to talk to him, and so I didn't know what to expect. But the person I came to know over the course of that conversation was exactly the person I felt like I'd come to know through our coverage. And so what I said to Dean is just how impressed I was. Actually, I think it was Elizabeth Buemiller, I think it was the Washington editor, at how impressed I was at how accurate a sense of this guy that I felt had come through.
Okay. So I think he took about a week to tweet about it.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be off the record, but
Yeah.
he couldn't quite resist. So I can quote what he said. He said, this is President Trump's tweet. Had a very good and interesting meeting at the White House with A.G. Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times. Spent much time talking about the vast amounts of fake news being put out by the media and how that fake news has morphed into phrase, enemy of the people. Sad. Was that the truth?
I guess this is one case where I'd agree with Giuliani, the truth isn't true, right? No, that obviously was not what our conversation was. And, I won't pretend to get in his head as to what he was thinking when he typed that out. But, our conversation, was, we did touch on his use of phrases like fake news and enemy of the people in particular, but it was in the context of my profound concern that his rhetoric was not just divisive, but it was dangerous and was directly contributing to a rise of threats against journalists domestically. But in particular, I wanted him to understand how profoundly he was putting journalists and journalistic institutions at risk abroad, where, and I said this to him, I said, I don't expect you to bite your tongue. If you want to complain about the New York Times, you want to tweet about us, you want to attack my institution, my company by name, you want to attack me by name, go for it. But these broad-sided attacks on journalism are having a extremely damaging effect on the ability of all sorts of journalists to do their work all over the world, and it is enabling a crackdown on a free press by tyrants and dictators around the world.
I mean, he didn't seem to have listened to what you said because, if you've seen what's happened since. And so maybe we can look at both aspects. First of all, in the United States, how concerned are you about the security? It's become a hostile environment for many journalists in the United States now. How concerned are you? And what has the Times actually done on the security side?
I mean, we've been forced to take some security measures, and it's a really troubling time. And when I talk about security, I'm not just talking about physical security. I think one of the things we don't talk about enough as an industry right now is digital security as well. I mean, the brutal and constant attacks that my colleagues, particularly women and particularly people of color, are receiving on a daily basis on Twitter and many other online venues it's really unnerving. I mean, we recently had to move a reporter because of the systematic doxing that resulted in, the publishing of addresses and explicit threats against her safety. So there's that side of it, and then there's physical security, and a pipe bomb was just sent to CNN. A newsroom was stormed by a gunman in Annapolis that left a number of journalists dead. These are not abstract concerns at this point. But as I said, I am much more profoundly, or even more profoundly, concerned about America's retreat as a champion of free speech and a free press around the world, and in countries where it was already incredibly difficult to be an independent journalist and to ask tough questions and to hold power to account. I think it's only become more difficult in the last year.
I mean, I've been in this game 45 years, maybe, long time. I've never seen a situation like this. I mean, just to you can't do the roll call because there's too many people. I mean, there's a Khashoggi case, and which is an atrocity. We have 2 Reuters journalists jailed recently in Myanmar. I mean, AFP, we've taken a lot of hits in Kabul. There's this latest attempt to shut down Rappler in the Philippines, and very close to home we have our own Victor Mallet, whom you know, the Financial Times correspondent, vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club. He was de facto expelled from Hong Kong with no explanation, and has now been refused re-entry. So, I mean, would you lay that? You can't lay that at the door of Donald Trump, but I mean, do you think there's a Trump effect or a Trump influence that's created this climate?
Yeah, I mean, I used the word climate at the end, and I think that's the word I keep coming back to. What we're seeing reminds me a lot of climate change, in that it is impossible to look at any one storm and say climate change caused this storm. But what we do know is that climate change is making storms more frequent and more powerful. And I think that this type of dangerous anti-press rhetoric is making storms more frequent and more powerful.
Okay. Just going back slightly to the fake news awards, I mean, that Donald Trump published last year, they were actually mainly errors made by media, his fake news awards, if you remember. I mean, he criticised an op-ed.
I honestly had forgotten about them until you just mentioned them.
But, I mean, he criticised
I think we won it. I think we got first place in the fake news awards. Yeah. I actually I saw Marty Barron a couple of weeks later, and he was genuinely disappointed. He was, like his competitive streak, he was like, I can't believe that Times got first place in the fake news.
I mean, you got it for an op-ed, actually, so that was kind of strange. But just looking at it, do you think in their kind of dislike of Donald Trump, following an anti-Donald Trump narrative, do you think some news organizations are maybe publishing stories faster on flimsier sources that they might have taken a bit longer to publish if it had been Barack Obama? I think there's a bit of rush to publish because of the anti-Trump sentiment.
I won't speak for other news organizations, but we are doing everything we can as an organization to keep the report focused squarely on a singular pursuit of the truth. And we do not have any public agenda. We are, or private agenda for that matter, we are not the opposition. And I've said that publicly on a number of occasions, even though many of our readers would like us to be. But what we are doing is reporting aggressively on, one of the most disruptive and norm-defying presidential administrations our country has ever seen, and that's our mission. I look at someone like Mike Schmidt, who has been accused at times of, who basically is such a good investigative reporter. He keeps getting these unbelievable scoops. The Comey loyalty oath, the president's lawyer's declaration that the president is above all law and cannot be held to any law. So scoop after scoop, and there's many on the American right who would love to dismiss him, as a liberal journalist. He's also the same guy who broke the story on Hillary Clinton's email server, and to me that's emblematic of what we do. The New York Times seeks the truth. We hold power to account, and we help people understand the world. And that's the mission that I believe is needed in this moment.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left, so I can take questions from the floor. And please give your name, and if you do represent an organization, which organization you represent. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Kim Ming Liu, I'm a former journalist, and I'm proud to say I'm still a subscriber to your print edition.
Oh, God bless you.
I would like to ask you about the New York Times relation with Beijing these days. If I remember correctly, your predecessor, when he visited the Chinese capital in August 2001, he secured a meeting with the president of China at that time and conduct an interview. And afterwards, the New York Times website was unblocked. So did you or would you visit China this time and perhaps to try to unleash the magic again? Thank you.
Boy, those are big shoes to fill. Look, we are deeply committed to covering China. We've been expanding our coverage. We're deeply committed to the Chinese audience. We've continued to run our, Chinese language site for, I don't know how many years it is now, even though it's blocked, because we do have a, loyal and committed audience who's relying on us. And using, firewalls, using VPNs to escape the firewall. And I'm hopeful. I think it's a source of strength for any country and any leadership to welcome independent journalism. I think that's a sign of strength. And I am hopeful that the Chinese government will at some point in the near future show that sign of strength. It's part of what makes the Hong Kong leadership's decision with Victor so disappointing, right? One of the things that made this place special was its historic commitment to a free press, and I think it makes for a healthier society, I think we're going to continue to push aggressively. I have no plans to go to China on this trip, if that's what you're asking. And sadly, no secret interview with the president in my back pocket just yet.
Okay, thanks. We have a question on the veranda. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, my name is Joyce Murdoch. I'm a longtime journalist. I'm read on Twitter that the New York Times is now distributing China daily. If that's true, how do you square that with New York Times belief in truth?
We are not distributing the China Daily in an ongoing basis. The China Daily, like any advertiser, has purchased advertising space in the paper, and we've sold them that advertising space. We're getting some criticism for it, and so let me just tell you directly. I also, let me tell you directly that I've only just heard about all this in the last day or so, so I haven't had a chance to dig in. So it's possible as I learn more that maybe my view will change. But I actually think it's a dangerous game for a news organization to start looking at every single advertiser and start vetting them for their political leanings. As long as advertising is fully and clearly labeled as advertising, as long as it meets basic standards, I think our position has been that we will accept it, even if it's promoting causes we don't agree with, promoting products we don't agree with, and I can see you shaking your head. I'm sure it's an unsatisfying decision. The problem is if you start going advertiser by advertiser, what you're actually not doing, you think what you're doing is eliminating advertisers, but what you are doing is you're making an editorial affirmative endorsement of every other advertiser, and that's dangerous. So it's something that I'll be digging into, but that's where I stand right now, just as a matter of broader principle.
Okay, thanks, Tara.
IAG, I'm Tara Joseph from the American Chamber of Commerce and also a former journalist. Thanks very much for your comments on journalism. I want to pick up on journalists. And one issue in the States, people say with notable publications like the New York Times and others, is that the journalists are graduates of elite colleges, Ivy League universities, and have actually, in their reporting in a way, contributed to the polarization of society in the States because they don't understand the world in between the coasts of America. Does it worry you if you have staff who are all from that world? And I think if we look around at the elite publications in the States, many of them are from the coasts and from elite schools.
It's a great question and something I wrestle with a lot. So let me say a few things. I mean, one, diversity is important to newsrooms, for a reason beyond mission or morality, right? Diversity is important to newsrooms in part because our job is to help people understand the world. And to report on the world with nuance and insight, you need to have a diversity of experience and background and identity. And that very much includes, where people are coming from and, socioeconomic background and, are they church going, and, veteran status, as well as, gender and race and some of the stuff that comes to mind typically first. So that's one thing. I mean, two, you're asking me, whether I believe it's important that we cover, the center of the country. You're talking to a former Kansas City bureau chief. My job was to cover the Great Plains for the New York Times. I covered North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Missouri. It was the best job I ever had, including this one. And one of the reasons it was such a great job, my family roots, half my family is rooted in New York, as you might expect, half is rooted in Topeka, Kansas. And so this is a part of a country that's very close to my heart. I think every good journalist knows that the best place to be is the place where the other journalists aren't, and where your editor doesn't think they already know the story. And so really committed there. One of the things, the statistic I'm probably proudest of at the New York Times, and I'm going to say the international statistic, but we have one that's very similar domestically, is that we put reporters on the ground in 163 countries last year. I think the year before that it was about 170. And when I say on the ground, I mean we send a reporter to these places to experience with their senses, to dig into the stories in a way that you just can't do by phone or by, at your computer. And so I think that on-the-ground presence and the understanding and the subtleties that come with it are essential to our act. as far as, your other question about, Ivy League background, I think that that's a really important thing that every leader in any journalistic institution should make sure that we're not letting impressive resumes crowd out the diversity that, that I think that newsrooms, which have historically had a much more of a blue-collar feel, has long been a source of strength for them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Nina Xiang from China Money Network. Nowadays, about 95 or even 99% of my non-work related news consumption take place via audio through my 5 smart speakers at home. So, what other future technology like this, like increasing voice interaction with our smart devices, what other technology trends you see that's going to further disrupt entities like New York Times, and how do you adapt? Thank you.
Do you listen to The Daily?
Unfortunately, Google Home and also Alexa, their news program doesn't include The Daily, I think. Yeah.
Look, this is one of the questions that any organization that's adjusting to this digital, transformation that's happening around us is asking all the time. I can answer very specifically about how we're thinking about audio, our experiments in VR, our experiments in augmented reality. We have a new TV show that's launching on cable and on Hulu early next year. But I think that the thing that we've learned is actually the through line of all of those, which is know what you're for. And at the New York Times, what we do and what we feel like we're uniquely able to do at scale, and when I say scale, I mean in 160 countries every year and, with 200 stories a day, is produce original, expert, on-the-ground, deeply reported journalism that's independent, fair, and accurate. That's what we do. And then the question is, how do all of these different interfaces support that mission? And I think for a while we were thinking about the interfaces as as an end in and of themselves, and I think that's a mistake. And I think that's, I think why all of us have rolled our eyes on phrases like pivot to video is because it's, or even why all of us probably chafe at the phrase content, right, is because it's absent of value, right? Like a pivot to, you don't pivot to video. You have something you can offer people in video. And I think we've been, as an industry, thinking format first rather than value first. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how in each of these spaces, the New York Times can add value to readers and users and listeners and in a way that's consistent with our identity. And to me, The Daily is the best example of anything we've done. And I'm really proud of it because it feels quintessentially of the New York Times. It's smart, it's serious, it's not dumbed down, it showcases the deep reporting and expertise of our journalists, but it also feels quintessentially a podcast, right? And with all the strength that come from that medium, it feels friendlier, more familiar, intimate at times, and I don't think any of us would have used friendly, familiar, or intimate to describe the old gray lady, in print 10 years ago. So that is just a different way that we can reach a totally different audience. And The Daily is now the most downloaded podcast in the United States, and is reaching an entirely different generation, and a generation that probably would have been saying, I don't think the New York Times is for me. And so that's how we think of those challenges.
I think we've got time for probably one or maybe just 2 more. So one question from the back here.
Thank you. Mark Michelson from I'm Asia. Thank you very much, Mr. Sulzberger. It's not the Great Lady anymore, I don't think. I hope it is in the quality and integrity of your journalism and reporting, but not in other ways, and I think it's pretty impressive what you're trying to do to change it. But I want to talk about communications back to the United States again, I'm afraid. Donald Trump, for whatever you think of him, has made communications sort of the center of what he does, and has made that appealing to a lot of people. Has that changed the way you think going forward as to how we're going to conduct, not just in 2020, but these kind of elections? Is that why Oprah and Mark Cuban and others have been mentioned, you know, for whatever reasons, because they can communicate and they can reach a certain audience? Have we come to that point? I mean, going forward, not just in 2020, but beyond? Or are we haven't changed that much? And anyway.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question right. Are you saying, have we got into a new generation
Yes.
of political leaders who's bypassing the
Yeah,
media?
and also another way of just reaching people
Yeah.
in a different way, mainly through communications and through, you know, different parts of reaching people.
I mean, I think the media ecosystem has changed enough, you know, thanks to social media and thanks to, I mean, just in so many ways, that I'm not sure the old sort of paper of record model was the right model anyway. I mean, I think, you know, where we can add value is, you know, our expertise, our ability to dig deep and investigate, our ability to ask tough questions, and so, you know, I think it's certainly capable. And in fact, you know, it feels like we've been watching this trend for years now of more political leaders and more business leaders trying to sort of control their own narratives, you know, by controlling their own bullhorn. I think that's fine, you know. This sort of like the rote updating of, you know, so and so said this was never the highest purpose of free and independent press. I think our role is to then deeply scrutinize, you know, what's behind those words and what's behind their actions, and that I think we're continuing to do.
Maybe just to finish, just looking forward, I mean, both on the business side in the media, given the fact that big tech is taking so much of the advertising revenues these days, and also on the pure journalism side, looking at the attacks. When you're waking up in the morning, are you an optimist? Are you positive, or did you think we got a lot of serious work ahead of us? How do you did the innovation report, so you are a bit of you're very good at looking in crystal balls, so how do you see things in the next few years?
I don't know about looking at a crystal ball. Look, I think I'm a little bit of both. I think that we are facing as an industry an unprecedented confluence of threats to journalism. And those threats, you know, I break up mainly the threat to the business model, the intermediation of publishers and readers by the technology platforms, and the decline of trust in our country or around the world. Those should not be taken lightly. And we've already started to see the consequence of that. I mean, a 50% decline in working journalists in a 20-year period in the world's most important democracy is, you know, should be terrifying to all of us. I also think we're seeing hopeful signs as well. You know, people are starting to pay money for journalism again, and even among those who aren't paying money, people are reading quality journalism in unprecedented numbers. And, you know, every time I talk to a class of, you know, college journalism students, or we recently at the Times hosted the editors of you know, 200 university newspapers. There's a generation of journalists who are coming in who are really ready for this challenge. So, you know, I think there is a way through this moment. We're determined to find it. We're feeling really good about our progress, but it's going to be hard as hell. And you know, and when I do wake up in the morning, it gets me out of bed. And you know. And it's nice to wake up feeling like you're fighting for something important.
Okay, A.G. Sulzberger, thank you very much.
Thank you.